Hello everybody. Welcome to the fourth and the final episode of my series of tutorials on how to build a Hacker News-like website using Django. Hi, my name is Arun Ravindran and my website is arunrocks.com. In this episode, we'll be showing you how you can implement voting. First, the straightforward way in Django using forms, and in the second, using Ajax, which would be the manner in which a user would expect voting to work in a site like this. Next, we'll be covering mixins, which is usually a confusing topic. Then we'll talk about how we can display the voted status. And finally, we'll cover ranking algorithms, which is an important way in which these sites, which are like social news aggregators, work. I also touch upon how background tasks are implemented in Django. So if you remember, let's have a look at how our website looks like at the moment. We have a list of headlines, and what we'd like to do is to have a voting button as to where the current score, that is like 14, is displayed on the site. How do we do this? If you remember, currently what we're doing to show votes is to add votes is to use the admin interface and directly add a new item. This is not very friendly for users. What we'd like is to have some kind of a link over here in which you can say a plus or an up arrow in which we can click on it and we can vote. The most straightforward way of doing this, and one of the ways in which I initially implemented this, was to create a link. That link should take you to something like a URL like vote slash probably the item or the headline primary key, and just signal that as a voting indicator. There is a problem with this approach. This is not usually recommended. This is usually called a destructible change. For example, deleting an item is called a destructive change. When you vote for something, you're actually registering some record. You're actually creating a new record which signals that you're liking a particular headline. So all these changes, which are likely to require the user to make a create action or a delete action, is usually implemented using post form of forms. So in normal HTTP, we have two kinds of verbs, the get and the post. So when I say post, I'm referring to this post, where when you submit a form, the URL is not showing you what was actually submitted, and most of the information is actually passed on as an encoded object into the web page. So this might sound confusing, so let me quickly show you how it is done. So as you remember, in our project, we have models, and we already have a model which shows you the vote. Here we have the voter as one of the members of the vote object, which tells you who voted for that particular item, and we also have the link which shows you what link was voted for. So this is actually a relationship between a voter and a link. And how do we create this vote item? Obviously, as we showed in our link part of the previous tutorial, we can use a form. And since this is a model which contains the essential elements, we can use a model form. So let's quickly jump on to forms.py and create this particular class. Of course, we must remember to import that model. So let's do that. Let's import vote. We'll also follow the simple naming convention of vote form, and forms.model forms as before. We'll just make a simple meta class in which we say the model is vote. That's all. So now we have the form ready. We need to handle whenever a form gets submitted. So naturally we need to create a view. In this case, what we're going to do is we are going to implement a form view. So let's open views. So far we have created the CRUD views and the detail views. A form view is a very simple class-based view which is used for handling forms. Let's first import a form view from generic edit. We have form view. Also from forms, let's import the form we just created, which is vote form. And from models, let's import, let's make this a little more consistent. And let's import vote. So once we are done all the necessary imports, let's start creating the form view. The name we'll use is vote form view, and we'll derive it from form view. In a form view, the essential things to note are we'll have to name of an attribute called form class, and it is nothing but the model form which we just created. We have to define, generally we define two functions as well. What happens when the form is valid is called form valid function, which takes just the self and the form. And I'll just put a placeholder there called pass. And what happens when the form is invalid? How do we handle that? Using the same signature of self and form. Another placeholder there. So, to quickly tell you what functionality must be implemented here, we need to programmatically just create a very simple function here, which just says votes.objects.create, and we should be able to create a vote. We should be able to name the voter, which is the user who is logged in currently. We should be able to use the link. So this is the core functionality that we require. But there are a couple of catches here. The first catch is that we should know whether the user has voted before. All we are trying to do here is we are trying to implement a toggle. If the user has already voted, he should be able to toggle out of it. So he should be able to unvote it when the form is submitted. And if the form was, if the user has not voted before, submitting this form would mean that this object should be created. So the first thing we'll do here is try to understand what was submitted in this form. Basically, which link was submitted in this form. So we'll create a we'll try to extract that called link. Get object or 404. This is a very familiar function for Django developers. I'll tell you how to import that in a moment. And the primary key should be extracted from the form.data, which is what the user submitted, and it should be link. It should be found in user variable called link, form variable called link. Next, we need to know who is the currently logged in user. We'll not get that from the we need not get that from the form because we already know that from self.request. Now coming to the logic of whether we have a previous vote. So we call it prev vote, and we use a simple filter, vote.objects.filter, with the parameters as voter being the user and the link being the link. It's basically the same parameters that we would have used if we are creating something. We are just looking for something which is already in existence. So we call it has voted, and we'll use a simple logic which says the count, which is the prev votes.count being greater than 0. Basically, it should be at least 1. So now comes the big if condition. If it is not voted, not has voted, I would add a vote. Basically, we're going to use the same function. It says votes.objects.create, and it should be vote, I believe. Sorry about that. It should be vote.objects.created, and just for the sake of information, I'm going to say print voted. This would be only used for debugging. I'll promise that I remove it, because using print functions within a Django website is not really recommended. But I'll remove that in a moment. The else condition is when you want to delete that vote, which basically means that you have already voted and you have submitted the form again. So here what we do is we take the first object which was returned by previous votes, and we call the delete function for that. Ideally there should be just one item, and that one item should be removed. And as before, we use an unvoted function. And finally, the form object must return. So when we return, we'll redirect it to a page which could be home. So in this case, we haven't defined some functions, so we'll quickly do that from Django shortcuts. Go shortcuts, import redirect, and import get object or 404. So that should get rid of all the warnings. We have the form invalid function to complete as well. So again, let's print something here. Again, this would be removed. It's not recommended. And we again return to redirect home. So we have implemented the view now. Let's go ahead and update the template as well. Let's go to Steel Rumors, Templates, Links, a linked list.html, which is the home page of the website, and let's make sure that there is a plus sign which is next to each headline. For that, we should go inside the for loop. The entire for loop inside repeats through all the headlines, and within each headline we should create a form. You might be wondering why not create a form for the entire site, just one form outside the for loop, but that would confuse when we are submitting the form, because we won't know which headline is being submitted. In this case, let's quickly create a form. Here I'm just going to paste the relevant areas. So we're going to say post. So this is what I meant by the post method, and we're going to action. We haven't defined this URL yet, but it'll be a link to our view, and we're going to call it the vote form class. As you would remember, we need to ensure that certain form related template syntax should be followed. So CRSF token is one of the mandatory things in a Django form. Next, we need to define the input objects for our two elements in the voting form. The first one was the link, and the second one was the voter. So the link in this case would be a hidden link. Basically, we'll use input type hidden, and we'll say that the link ID is nothing but the link which is extracted from the for loop, and the username will be nothing but the currently logged in user. Of course, we are not using the user because we don't trust what is being passed from a form as much as possible. We'll also add a button which indicates that it's ready for voting. So it has a plus sign, which should be an up arrow, but I'm just using a plus sign here. And finally, towards the end, we'll actually close the the form, just before the end of the for loop. So that's a very basic form which will appear, or a basic button, which the only visible part being the button, in front of each headline. And now, of course, we need to go to urls.py and add this URL. So as we have to import this view, let's do that. It's called vote form view, and let's add it right here as URLs vote. So vote would be just our URL. As I said, we are using post form of vote submission, so we don't need to mention the URL. We don't need to mention the ID in the URL. It's not the information is passed as a post. We should ensure that it is authenticated, because remember that we are using the logged in username, so the person should be authenticated. So we are using that wrapper. And then, as before, we are just calling the vote form class-based view, derived class-based view, and using the name vote for this particular URL route. Hopefully, this should be reflected in our site now. I think there is some error in our, I believe it's in our form. So let's quickly go there. So I think we have used the plural model forms. Sorry about that typo. So great. So now we have a plus sign which appears across each of these voting items. Well, we switch back to the console where we have our eyes noting whatever changes are happening for the print statements. So now once we just click on any voting button, and come back to the console, we can see that something was unvoted. Probably we had added a voted object before. And again we click on something, it again gets unvoted. So probably it'll go somewhere where it's nothing is voted. And yes, so we can see that a link which does not have any voting status has become voted. So we basically have a very rudimentary voting system built using Django forms. However, this is not how you would experience a normal voting user interface. When you click on something, it should actually not refresh the entire page. It should just do an AJAX request and change the status of the button from plus to minus, or up arrow becomes disabled, or some user interface change like that, which immediately shows you. That's what we're going to do next. We are going to import a couple of JavaScript libraries so that the user interface becomes much more snappier. Before that, we should ensure that you have something called the static JavaScript, which was copied from our goodies pack from our previous tutorial. This is located inside steelrumors/static.javascript. If you go to that directory, you must have already copied these two files if you had followed the previous tutorials, which is nothing but jQuery and jQuery, which is minified, and JavaScript code which shows what to do when somebody clicks on a button which submits the voting form. It prevents submitting the form by default. It goes and does an AJAX request over here, posts that particular form to a URL called vote, which is already handled, and it just changes the text of the button to minus if it is voted, and if it is not voted, sorry, if it is successfully voted, it becomes a minus, and if it is unvoted, it becomes a plus. And again, it enables the button after the AJAX request is completed. So this is a very simple JavaScript code which accomplishes what we have to do. Sorry. Let's include that in our base template go to template, base, and just after our style sheets, let's include this script for jQuery first, and followed by our code for the voting. So we'll save that, and let's go back to views. So in views, we are doing quite a bit of changes. So I'm not going to type the entire thing. Let me first introduce you to mixin. This mixin would be called JSON form mixin. In this piece of code, what we're trying to do here is we are just deriving it from object, which is the minimum that you need for a mixin. We are going to create a custom function called create response. This would be also used in our vote form view. What a mixin generally does is, as you would remember from our previous mixin which we did called random mixin, a random gossip mixin, it just overrides some function which would be used in our derived class. So in this case, the random gossip mixin was used in the list view, and we knew that the list view would contain something called get context data. So we derive both from a class and a mixin to create a new class, which is a new view, and the mixin just changes a small behavior. In this case, it just changed the random gossip, just added a context variable called random quip and added that variable. So two things you have to note here is that the base class, whenever you derive from a mixin and a base class, the base class goes to the rightmost end and the mixin goes to the left of that base class. And the second thing to note is that the mixin should be derived from an object, or anything derived from an object. Usually in modern Python classes, most classes are derived from object. So coming back to JSON form mixin, what JSON form mixin does is, currently our vote form view does not use Ajax. Ajax is nothing but posting a JSON, posting something through Ajax posting something through JavaScript asynchronously. In this case, we are posting a JSON object asynchronously. So just to do that piece of functionality, we could have done that already inside vote form view, but I have just created a generic class which could be used for other JSON purposes also, and we are going to create a response function in this, which does nothing but preparing a neat response. So create response takes a dictionary which just contains what has to be returned. In this particular class, this dictionary is converted into a JSON object using JSON dumps vdict, and an HTTP response is created using that. For that, let's import these two. Import JSON, which is built into a standard Python installation, and from Django.http, let's import HTTP response, which builds a standard HTTP response based on whatever has been passed on to it as a content, and also has the content type defined. We can also respond what kind of status it is. So 200 means it was successful, and 500 generally means some kind of an application error. So in this case, if the passed on value, the boolean is actually true, it means that it is successful, otherwise it is false. And it just returns this response, and a view could simply return this as is. Our next set of changes for making voting in the form of an Ajax voting should be in this two functions. It should be in this class. So I'm going to modify form valid. I'm also going to modify form invalid. For form before that, we are going to add another create response within this particular class as well. So like I said, this is user defined function. We are defining a new function which actually creates a response. inside vote form view, it would return an HTTP response, which would require refreshing the page, probably using a redirect. However, if we use a form mixin like JSON form mixin, it would probably change that functionality. So let's first define the standard functionality, which is nothing but creating a response using HTTP response again. In this case, even though we are dumping it using a JSON, this thing, we are actually not calling it application JSON. So this would be a standard text / HTML response, and the response again would change based on whether it's valid or not. Pretty much similar to the JSON form mixin. The most important difference being the content type being overridden. Our form valid function remains pretty much the same. As before, we are going to find out what is the link, what is the user, whether there are previous votes just for the unvoting voting toggling functionality, and the has voted boolean object, of course. The next set of functionality is going to be different. We're going to have a dictionary which is called return, RET, and it's going to have a default value of succeeded, which is success becomes 1. If we are going to add a vote, we are going to say this particular return value will have another key which is called vote object, and that vote object would contain the successfully created votes ID, which is generally returned to indicate that successfully voting has been completed. If it was deleted, we are going to create a separate key which is called unvoted, and that's going to be true. And then we are going to call our function which is create response, which in this class would be create response, which would be invoked over here. But if it was used as a mixin, which we are using for JSON form mixin, probably this would be overridden. We'll get to that in a minute. And this particular return, which is containing all these three keys, would be returned, prepared as a JSON response. What happens in form invalid? Form invalid would be pretty much a standard error response. So we are going to say success was 0, which means it did not succeed, and the form errors would be contained in a key called form errors, and we'd create response for this as well. So as you can see, create response is called for both. For valid or invalid forms, we need a response which has to be in the form of a JSON object. So creating a common return function makes sense after all. And finally, we are going to derive vote form view and JSON form mixing to create our final view, which is what the user is going to see, which is called vote form view. So we cannot use the same name again. So I'm going to rename the previous vote form view to vote form base view. So we're going to derive JSON form mixing and vote form base view. As I said before, it should go to the rightmost end, which is the base view, and the JSON form mixin, being a mixin, should go to the left. Let's save that. This actually takes care of what we need to do to implement Ajax. But we are not done yet, because if we go back to our functionality in our website, all it takes care right now is if we click on the plus sign, it becomes minus. Of course, we are yet to implement that functionality, but it'll just toggle the buttons whenever the page is loaded. But what I would like to see is that when the page is loaded, what I have already voted should be having some kind of indication, say a minus sign, which says that I have already voted this. Currently, the page is not able to do that because it does not have that context inside when we actually load this page. So let's add that context. As you might have already guessed, we'll do that using getContextData. First, we'll go back to the linked list view, which shows the home page over here. And again, I'm going to avoid most of the typing by just pasting the code here. So we're going to override the get context data, and we're going to write the context based on what already linked list view provides us by invoking the base class get context data. So once we have everything populated in get context data, we first check if the user has been logged in. If the user has been logged in, we find out two sets of links. The first set of links are the links which that particular user has voted for, which is basically found out by using objects filter, and if the voter is that particular user. And the second set of links are the links in that particular page. The whole logic behind this is that I'm going to use a new context variable called voted to keep track of a list of links which have been voted. And when I say list, I literally mean a Python list, something like brackets 1, 4, 8, just the primary keys, for example, just the primary keys of all the voted links. The only principle that I'm following here is I'm going to put in as little as possible into a context variable so that it takes lesser time for querying, and it's not very heavy as a data which has to be passed into a view. So I'm going to filter as much as possible. The first set of links are the ones which are voted. The next set of links are which are already in that particular page. So I'm going to use the context variable object list, which will return all the links which are present in that particular page. As you would remember, we have implemented pagination, so this would not return the entire list of links, which could be hundreds or thousands. In this particular case, there are only 5 items in that particular link, as we have paginated. So we just get a maximum of 5 items for that particular page in links in page. And what are we interested? We are interested in an intersection. If this was a Venn diagram, I would be interested in an intersection between voted and links in page. So what I'd do is I'd run a filter on voted, and I'll find a link underscore ID in what are the links in that particular page, and I'll keep it in voted. So keep remembering, till now we have a list of objects, but what we want in the context variable is a list of numbers. So to convert these objects into numbers, I use something called values underscore list, which is a query set function, which will ask you what particular attribute of that particular object you would be interested in, and will just extract that value based on that attribute and put in a flat list if you put flat equals true. So as I wanted, the context variable would now just be only the voted items of that particular user of that particular page. So it's very specific, and it would not contain probably more than 5 items. I would say a maximum of 5 items. And then finally I'd return the context. I'll say that, and now so that the functionality appears on the front end on the user interface, I'll go to the lists, linked list HTML, which is the home page. I need to change this particular line by adding a couple of if conditions, so that based on the voted context variable, I can change the ifs condition. But before that, I need to ensure that I have also handled if the user is not logged in scenario. So for that, I add an if condition which says if the user is authenticated. In case the user is not authenticated, which is this if condition, I will show a disable button, which is button disabled, and say please log in to vote if the mouse is hovered over. And if that particular user is logged in, it will go to the else condition, which is else if the link is not voted. So I'm sorry, this should have appeared over here. So if the user has not yet voted, so it's a good thing to show the plus sign so that the user can vote. And the final else condition being the user has been authenticated, so that he is logged in, or he or she is logged in, but they are not able to see, they have already voted, and they don't want to see the plus sign. They want to see an unvote option, which is the minus sign. And we finally end the if condition using an end if. So this set of if-else-if conditions should take care of the Ajax scenario. Let's see if it worked. Let me quickly refresh this page. Go to a button which, okay, this item has not been voted. Let me vote this. So it automatically toggles to a minus sign. And now if I want to unvote this, I can toggle it back to a plus sign. Note that the entire page was not refreshed. It's an Ajax request. If you want, you can log out and log in as another user, say foo. And you should be able to see the items which are not being voted. And you can actually vote them and unvote them. So finally, we have Steel Rumors working in a way so that users can actually influence by voting which article appears on the top. But we have a problem. People who visit sites like Steel Rumors don't always like to see the highest voted item always on the top of the list. They'd like to see fresh content as well. At the time being, we are actually just showing the highest voted item. That is because that is the way the links have been sorted. We'd like to change this somewhat to make it much more similar to other social networking websites, for example, Hacker News. Let's see how Hacker News actually implements this. Hacker News actually uses a different number for sorting, different from the number of votes. It calculates a derived number from the votes called calculated score or a rank score. In this case, a rank score is calculated not only by using the number of votes, it also takes into account how long the site has been showing this post since it has been submitted. Let me show you an early version of the formula. How the formula works is shown by this graph. As you can see, since the score decreases as the time passes, this ensures that no particular item remains on the front page no matter how highly voted it is for more than a certain number of hours. So even if it is very highly voted, it might be there for a longer period of time, but in the long run it actually goes down and the score becomes nearly zero. The formula is quite simple. It's just a fraction which uses p minus 1 on the numerator, which is the number of points, and minus 1 is to probably cancel the effect of a self vote, and t plus at the denominator we have t plus 2 to the power of g. Basically this means that t is the number of hours for which this post has been submitted since it has been appearing on our site, and plus 2 to probably add an increment, and to the power of g, which is a constant which we can tweak and find out based on how fast we want something to fall. So it's pretty straightforward. The score is directly proportional to the number of points you get for that particular news item, and it's inversely proportional to the time it has been submitted. So as time goes by, the score goes down, just like the graph shows you. Now what I'm going to show you is how to use the model that we have used for links to calculate the rank score. As we have made an allowance for this in the beginning itself, you can see that we already have an attribute called rank score. Now there are various places where we can calculate the rank score, but I feel that models.py itself is the most appropriate place because we are calculating something that is an essential logic for the application, and since most of the logic should reside within the models rather than the views or in the templates, I think models would be the most appropriate place to do this. And once again, since the formula is pretty much a straightforward port of this mathematical formula into Python, I'm probably just going to paste the code here to show you and walk you through the code. So as you can see, we're calling this function as setRank, and we are defining a couple of constants which I'll get to in a minute. I'm calculating a variable called delta, which calculates the difference between the current time and the time it was submitted. Now, I'm not using the function from datetime called now. I'm going to use Django datetime, Django utils, import from django.utils.timezone, import now. The advantage of using this now function is that it takes into account time zones, which is now the new standard way of using date times within Django. So we are using that function and we are subtracting it from the time it was submitted on. So delta is basically the amount of time which has been elapsed since a particular article has been submitted. Now we have to convert this into number of hours. So that's what item hour age means. Item hour age actually divides the number of seconds which is elapsed by the number of seconds in an hour, which is nothing but 60 multiplied by 60, 3600. Votes is nothing but the number of votes subtracted by the self vote factor. And finally the rank score is nothing but the same formula, votes divided by the power of item age plus 2 and gravity. In this case we have just copied the same gravity, 1.2, and finally we have to save this, otherwise we are just modifying the instance of this object, Python object, and we are not saving it actually into the database. So the final line actually persists the rank score into the database. Now another change we have to make to ensure that the front page shows the correct sorted order is that changing our link vote count manager. So since this is the manager we use rather than objects.all for pretty much most of our operations, including the sorting on the front page, we need to just add a simple order by minus rank score. And I'll just leave votes behind because that will be the second sorting key in case two items have the same rank score. For example, over a period of time they might tend to 0, then votes might become more significant as a sorting order. Next we'll actually create a script which will run in the background. This script is nothing but a way of calculating our rank or calculating the score every few seconds. This functionality is generally called a background task. We are not using a common common Django package called Celery for this, because Celery is of course the most preferred solution if this was a production application, but it hides you a lot of details and probably you might not know how it actually works. On the other hand, a script is fairly simple if you know batch files in DOS, or if you know a Unix bash script. You can easily follow what is happening here. So I'm going to create a script which will run in the background, and it will be using some kind of a sleep timer so that it can wake up every 5 seconds so that it can calculate ranks, or basically called set rank function for all the links every few seconds. Just to give you a background about background tasks, background tasks are very commonly used in websites. In fact, majority of the websites use background tasks. A background task could be anything from a midnight job to send a bulk email to a group, or it could be something like a long-running task after you uploaded say a big video onto a website, and the website doesn't want you to actually wait for the page to refresh. It just sends that as a background task, and keeps updating your page so that the page is giving you some kind of a progress bar or an update. So how we plan to do this for our Steel Rumors website is I'm going to create a function called rerank.py, and rerank.py again is a simple shell script. So I'm going to import the model from links.models import link, And once I've done that, I'm going to call a function called rank all, which just as a for loop for link with votes. With votes, as you would remember, is our custom manager. And link dot set rank. So that's all. This would take care of okay. Yeah, it's the syntax there. So this should be the heart of the shell script. We need to add a couple of other boilerplate content just to make it work under Django. So so the first line is nothing but the Unix shebang, so that it can be converted into a script. The next two lines actually ensures that the Django settings are imported correctly. Without this, the script would not work with Django, and Django would not, because Django would not be able to find the settings file. And next we are going to have some kind of a simple progress update on this console and the main program. So this would just basically show what is the update of all the links, and inside the main function we'd probably have an infinite loop which goes through ranking everything and showing all the links and going to sleep for 5 seconds, and then again the loop continues in an infinite manner. So how does all this work? Right now, if we just refresh our page, you would notice that nothing has changed. This is because all these links were there for a long time, so it's probably being sorted by votes as before. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to run our new script using Python. So Python rerank.py. So I think we should have called it from links.models. Yeah, so it's working. So now even again what just happened is all the links have a score now. However, it's not changed again. Let me submit a link and call it some test, and just add this, and just to make sure that it gets a good vote, I'll just give it a +1. So you can see that it has a 1 score. This is probably not enough because, as you remember, self scores are being cancelled. So let me log out and log in as admin, and go to the very end where our heading is and just give a +1 again. Now if you go back to home, you can see that our headline is right at the top. So if you go back to our console, you'll find that the test has a score of 0.44, while everything else has a 0 score, and sometimes a -0, but that's okay. So what does this mean? This means that at least for a certain number of hours, test would be the freshest link, and it will appear at the right at the top, even though it just has it just has 2 votes, and everything else has probably higher votes. The scores are actually leading the show here. One last thing, you would notice that this particular script has to be running in the foreground. It's not really a background task. So how do you convert this to a background task? Background tasks continue running even after you log out. So how would I do that is use, for example, NOHUP, that's no hang up, and Python -u, and then end it with an ampersand. So this turns it into a background task, and no hang up ensures that even if I log out, you will not get our script will not get interrupted. And -u just ensures that I just keep getting the output into the nohup.out. So that's kind of the output of the no hang up function. So As you can see, no hangup, as expected, is writing everything to no hangup.out. So we'll use the tail Unix function for this and use no hangup.out. And as you can see, you can pretty much follow what's happening in the background by going into the no hangup.out. So even if I interrupt this, it's not going to interrupt the function because the function is still running in the background. I think if you type jobs, you can see that, yeah. So jobs actually shows you that something is running in the background, and even if I log out, it's not going to affect it. And now time for the fun bit of the presentation. You can actually have quite a bit of fun by watching how well your newly submitted link has been performing. However, if you notice, our score is not changing pretty much. It has been stuck at 0.44 for quite some time. The reason for this is not very difficult to understand. Our seconds per hour is the resolution by which our score is going to change. So in case you want to see how the ranking algorithm works over a period of time, I would suggest accelerating time. How do you do that? Just by changing it by the resolution of our ranking script, which is 5 seconds. So once we save that, just go back to your console and find out if the 0.44 score has changed any drastically. So how do you do that? You probably had to kill the initial function because that's what is running in the background. Let me do a foreground and interrupt it. See if the jobs are still running. No. Okay. So now I can just run the re-rank algorithm once again. And if I do this, let me see if the tail function shows me any change in the scores. Oh my god. So the test function has been crashed to 0.044. So it seems that we spent a lot of time in between, but if this was a newly submitted link, let's see how it would have fared. Submit link test2, add the same drill, just go and vote for test2, log out, log in as someone else, and ensure that the same test2 is upvoted. Go back to home, fresh. Interesting. Okay, took a while to appear, but test2 seems to be right at the top now. Let's see how the score is faring. So test2 has, okay, see 0.1 became 0.08, and we wait a bit more and it becomes 0.07, and test2 will quickly meet the fate of test, our original test, and become 0. So then you'll pretty much have everyone on the equal footing. So if you're obsessed with watching scores, this is a pretty good entertainment, and that is one of the funs of having access to the back end of a social website. With that, we come to the end of part 4, as well as the end of this video tutorial series. Before we end, let me take you through a quick recap of what we covered in our previous parts. In the first part, we covered how to write a custom model manager. We also covered a relatively newer concept of generic class-based views in Django. Previously, it was generic function-based views, and we found how easy to use they were. In part 2, we covered Django registrations, which is a pretty popular package for registering users onto your website. And we also saw how you can create user profiles for adding additional information about a user, which makes it easy for them to personalize or for others to discover a new user on your website. In part 3, we covered the comments framework, which was built into Django, which is soon going to be deprecated and probably spun off into a third-party package, but it was definitely worthwhile learning it. We also learned how to use the CRUD views, which are again class-based views. In this part again, we saw Ajax, how to implement forms using Ajax, how to use mixins, how to use a ranking algorithm, and how to convert tasks into background tasks. So that brings us to the end of this series. I had fun making this video tutorial series, and I also enjoyed your feedbacks and your comments. I hope that you'll continue to send me your feedback and comments through either Twitter by tweeting me on my Twitter handle Arox, or you can comment on the corresponding blog article or on YouTube. Either way works fine. Or even better, you can actually send me pull request over GitHub for any bugs you might have found, or for some improvements that you think would help other beginners. Anything that would make this project more useful. So that brings me to the end of this tutorial. Thanks a lot for watching. I had great fun making this series. Have a good day.